What happens when local troublemakers think they've found an easy target in the quiet new teacher who drives an old Honda and keeps to herself? What if those same bullies who've been terrorizing their small town for years decided to cross a line they never should have crossed? And what if the soft-spoken woman they thought was defenseless turned out to have a past that would make hardened criminals think twice? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a woman who came to Millbrook hoping for a peaceful fresh start, trading her combat boots for classroom shoes and her military discipline for lesson plans. But when the town's most notorious troublemakers decided to make her their latest victim, they had no idea they were about to discover that some people carry more than just textbooks in their background. They were about to learn that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous, and that destroying someone's property might just be the biggest mistake of their lives. Get ready for a story that will show you why you should never judge a book by its cover, why respect is earned, not demanded, and what happens when someone pushes a warrior too far. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills surrounding Millbrook like a soft gray blanket, giving the small town an almost dreamlike quality as Sarah Mitchell drove her aging Honda Civic down Main Street for the first time. The odometer had long since stopped working, but she estimated the car had seen well over 200,000 miles of faithful service. The faded blue paint was chipped in places, the passenger side mirror was held on with electrical tape, and the air conditioning had given up the ghost somewhere outside of Denver. But it was hers, and it had carried her across 3 states too. This new beginning. Millbrook was the kind of place that time seemed to have forgotten, where American flags hung from every porch, and the biggest excitement was usually the annual Corn Festival. Population 3,847, according to the weathered sign. At the town limits, though Sarah suspected that number hadn't been updated in at least a decade. The main drag consisted of a single traffic light, flanked by Paulson's hardware store, Murphy's Diner, the First National Bank of Millbrook, and a handful of other businesses that looked like they'd been serving the community since the 1950s. Sarah parked her Honda in front of Murphy's Diner and stepped out, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from the long drive. She was a woman of average height with shoulder-length brown hair that she kept in a simple ponytail, wearing a modest blue sundress and comfortable flats. Her appearance was deliberately unremarkable, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd without drawing attention. But there was something in the way she carried herself, a certain economy of movement and awareness of her surroundings, that spoke of discipline and training to those who knew what to look for. The bell above Murphy's door chimed as she entered, and conversation momentarily paused as the locals sized up the newcomer. The diner had that timeless small-town atmosphere, with red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, and the lingering aroma of coffee and bacon grease. A large woman with graying hair and a warm smile approached from behind the counter, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. "You must be the new teacher," the woman said, extending a friendly hand. "I'm Helen Murphy. My husband Joe and I own this place. Welcome to Millbrook, honey." Sarah accepted the handshake with a genuine smile. Sarah Mitchell. "Thank you, Mrs. Murphy. I've heard wonderful things about your diner. Just Helen, please. And don't believe everything you hear about my cooking until you've tried it yourself," Helen said with a laugh. "Though I will say our apple pie has won the county fair 3 years running. You settling in all right? I know it can be tough moving to a new place where you don't know a soul." "I'm managing fine, thank you. Actually, I was hoping to get some breakfast before I head over to the school. Principal Hendricks wants to meet with me this morning to go over my classroom assignment." Helen's expression brightened. "Of course. Honey, you just sit yourself down anywhere you like. Coffee to start?" Sarah chose a booth near the window where she could watch the street while she ate, a habit that came from years of training she couldn't quite shake. As Helen poured her coffee, she noticed several other customers stealing glances in her direction. She was used to being the subject of curiosity in small towns, where new faces were rare and everyone knew everyone else's business. "Don't mind them," Helen said quietly, following Sarah's gaze. "We don't get many new folks around here, especially not young teachers. Most of our graduates head off to the big cities and never look back. Having someone choose to come here, well, it's got people wondering what your story is." Sarah took a sip of her coffee, which was surprisingly good, strong and fresh. "Not much of a story, really. I saw the job posting online and thought Millbrook seemed like a nice place to start over. It wasn't technically a lie, though it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was far more complicated, involving a medical discharge from the Marines, months of physical therapy, and a carefully constructed new identity designed to leave her military past behind. The whole truth included sleepless nights, phantom pain from old injuries, and a desperate need to find purpose in something other than warfare. But Helen didn't need to know any of that. "Starting over," Helen mused, refilling Sarah's cup without being asked. "Takes courage to pack up your whole life and head somewhere new. I admire that. Most folks just complain about their circumstances but never do anything to change them." Before Sarah could respond, the door chimed again and 3 young men walked in, immediately commanding attention through their sheer presence. They moved with the swagger of people who were used to being the biggest fish in a small pond, talking loudly and making no effort to keep their voices down. The one in. The lead was tall and broad-shouldered, with dirty blonde hair and a cocky grin that didn't reach his eyes. The other 2 flanked him like bodyguards, one short and stocky with arms covered in tattoos, the other lean and nervous-looking with darting eyes. Sarah noticed how the atmosphere in the diner immediately shifted. Conversations became quieter. People avoided making eye contact, and Helen's friendly demeanor became noticeably more guarded. These were clearly not popular customers, but they were tolerated, perhaps even feared. Well, what do we have here?" the tall one said, his voice carrying across the diner as his gaze settled on Sarah. "Don't think I've seen you around before, sweetheart." Sarah kept her expression neutral, years of dealing with difficult people teaching her the value of not escalating situations unnecessarily. She took another sip of her coffee and continued looking out the window, hoping they would lose interest and move on. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the young man said, stepping closer to her booth. "It's rude to ignore someone when they're being friendly." Helen appeared at Sarah's table with notepad in hand, her jaw set in a determined line. "Morning, Tyler. Your usual table in the back is open if you and the boys want to sit down." Tyler Brennan was 22 years old and had been the unofficial king of Millbrook's troublemakers since dropping out of high school at 17. His father owned the largest farm in the county, which gave Tyler a sense of entitlement and immunity from consequences. He'd been arrested twice for public intoxication and once for vandalism, but charges had always been dropped thanks to his father's influence and generous donations to various community causes. "Actually, Helen, I think I'd like to sit right here," Tyler said, sliding into the booth across from Sarah without invitation. "Get to know our new neighbor. I'm Tyler Brennan, and these are my associates, Marcus and Jim." The stocky one, Marcus, cracked his knuckles and grinned in a way that was meant to be intimidating. Jim just stood there, looking uncomfortable, like he'd rather be anywhere else but wasn't brave enough to leave. Sarah finally looked up from her coffee, meeting Tyler's gaze with calm, steady eyes. "I'm Sarah. Nice to meet you." "Sarah," Tyler repeated, drawing out her name. "Pretty name for a pretty lady. So what brings you to our little corner of paradise?" "Running from something. Someone?" "I'm the new teacher at Millbrook Elementary," Sarah said simply. "Just moved here for the job." Tyler's grin widened. "A teacher? Well, that's something. Hope you're better than the last one." Old Mrs. Patterson couldn't control a classroom full of 5-year-olds, let alone deal with the real troublemakers around here. There was an implied threat in his words, and Sarah recognized it for what it was. This was Tyler's way of establishing dominance, of letting her know who really ran things in Millbrook. She'd encountered similar personalities countless times in her military career, bullies who used intimidation and fear to control others. "I'm sure I'll manage just fine," Sarah said evenly. "Oh, I'm sure you will," Tyler said, his tone mocking. "Though you might want to be careful. This town can be tough on outsiders who don't know their place. Accidents happen, you know. Cars break down, windows get broken, that sort of thing." Helen's face flushed red with anger. "Tyler Brennan, you leave this young lady alone. She's done nothing to you." Tyler glanced at Helen dismissively. "Just making conversation, Helen. Helping our new teacher understand how things work around here." Sarah set down her coffee cup and leaned back in her seat, studying Tyler with the same calm assessment she'd once used to evaluate potential threats in hostile territory. She could see past his swagger to the insecurity underneath, the need to prove himself by intimidating others. He was dangerous not because he was particularly smart or skilled, but because he was unpredictable and had too much power for someone with so little self-control. "I appreciate the welcome," Sarah said, her voice carrying a subtle edge that Tyler was too arrogant to recognize. "I'm sure we'll get along just fine as long as everyone minds their own business." Tyler's grin faltered slightly at the implication, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, we will, teacher lady. We definitely will." He stood up, his cronies flanking him again. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Come on, boys. Let's let the lady finish her breakfast in peace." As they walked away, Tyler paused at the door and called back, "See you around, Sarah, real soon." The diner remained quiet for several moments after they left, as if everyone was afraid to breathe normally until they were sure the troublemakers were really gone. Helen returned to Sarah's table, her hands shaking slightly as she refilled the coffee cup again. "I'm sorry about that, honey," Helen said quietly. "Tyler and his crew have been causing problems around here for years. Most folks just try to stay out of their way." "Has anyone ever tried to do something about them?" Sarah asked. Helen sighed heavily. "His daddy's got too much money and influence. Sheriff Morrison's tried to rein them in a few times, but it never sticks. They're careful not to do anything too serious, at least not where anyone can prove it. Mostly they just make life unpleasant for people they don't like." Sarah nodded, filing away this information. She'd hoped to leave conflict behind when she came to Millbrook, but it seemed like trouble had a way of finding her regardless. Still, she wasn't the same person she'd been when she first enlisted. Military service had taught her patience, strategy, and the importance of choosing your battles wisely. "What can you tell me about the school?" Sarah asked, changing the subject. "I'm supposed to teach 4th grade, but I don't know much about what I'm walking into." Helen's expression brightened, grateful for the change in topic. "Millbrook Elementary is a good school, despite what Tyler implied. Principal Hendricks is a fair man who genuinely cares about the kids. You'll be taking over for Mrs. Patterson, who retired at the end of last year. She was a sweet lady, but Tyler was right about one thing. She had trouble with classroom management." "How bad is the Tyler problem at school?" "Well, he's not a student anymore, thankfully. But his younger brother Danny is in 6th grade. And the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, if you know what I mean. Plus, there are other kids whose parents work for the Brennan farm, and they tend to follow Danny's lead. It can be challenging." Sarah finished her breakfast while Helen shared more details about the school, the community, and the various personalities she'd encounter. The food was excellent, and Sarah found herself genuinely liking the older woman's straightforward manner and obvious concern for her welfare. As she prepared to leave, Helen caught her arm gently. "Sarah, honey, I hope you don't take this the wrong way. But Tyler meant what he said about accidents happening. He's got a mean streak, and he doesn't like being challenged. Maybe keep a low profile for a while, until you get settled? Sarah appreciated the concern, even if she couldn't follow the advice. Keeping a low profile had never been her strong suit, and she had a feeling that Tyler Brennan wouldn't be satisfied with anything less than complete submission from her. Still, she smiled and nodded. "Thanks for breakfast, Helen, and for the warning. I'll be careful." Millbrook Elementary School was a modest brick building that looked like it had been constructed sometime in the 1960s, with additions tacked on over the years as the community grew. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few cars belonging to staff who were preparing for the new school year that would begin in just 2 weeks. Sarah parked her Honda near the main entrance and gathered her purse and the folder containing her teaching credentials. Principal Robert Hendricks was waiting for her in the main office, a tall, thin man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He greeted her warmly and led her on a tour of the building, pointing out the cafeteria, library, gymnasium, and various classrooms. The school was clean and well-maintained, with colorful student artwork decorating the hallways and an obvious sense of pride in the facility. "Your classroom is just down here," Principal Hendricks said, leading her down a corridor lined with fourth-grade displays. "Mrs. Patterson left it in good shape, though you'll probably want to rearrange things to suit your own teaching style." Sarah's new classroom was spacious and bright, with large windows overlooking the playground and a reading corner filled with beanbag chairs and bookshelves. The walls were decorated with educational posters and student work from the previous year, and there was a sense of warmth and learning that immediately appealed to her. "It's perfect," Sarah said, walking around the room and imagining it filled with students. "When do I get to meet the other teachers?" "Most of them will be coming in next week for our preschool planning sessions. But I can introduce you to Carol Jenkins, our 5th-grade teacher. She's been here almost as long as I have and knows everything about how we do things at Millbrook Elementary." Carol turned out to be an energetic woman in her 40s with short red hair and a laugh that could probably be heard from 3 classrooms away. She immediately took Sarah under her wing, offering practical advice about everything from classroom supplies to the best places to shop for groceries in town. "The kids here are great," Carol explained as they sat in the teacher's lounge sharing coffee. "Most of them come from good families who care about education. But there are a few challenging ones, particularly in the older grades. Danny Brennan is probably the biggest handful you'll encounter, though thankfully he's not in your grade level." "I met his older brother this morning at Murphy's Diner," Sarah said carefully. Carol's expression immediately grew serious. "Tyler gave you trouble?" "Nothing I couldn't handle. But Helen Murphy seemed to think he might be a problem." Carol leaned forward, lowering her voice even though they were alone in the lounge. "Tyler Brennan is bad news, Sarah. He and his crew have been terrorizing this town for years, and his father's money keeps him out of real trouble. Most people just try to avoid them, but Tyler doesn't like being ignored." "What kind of things has he done?" "Vandalism mostly, though nothing that can be proven. Cars get keyed, windows get broken, tires get slashed. Always happens to people who've crossed him somehow, but there's never any evidence." Sheriff Morrison knows it's Tyler, but knowing and proving are 2 different things. Sarah absorbed this information, recognizing a pattern she'd seen before in other places. Bullies like Tyler thrived in environments where good people were too afraid or too powerless to stand up to them. They counted on fear and intimidation to maintain their control, and they rarely backed down unless forced to. Has he ever bothered school staff before? Not directly. But Mrs. Patterson's car was vandalized 3 times last year, always after. She'd had to discipline Danny. Paint scraped off, sugar in the gas tank, that sort of thing. She never could prove it was Tyler, but the timing was pretty suspicious. Sarah nodded grimly. It seemed like Tyler Brennan was going to be a problem whether she wanted one or not. But she'd dealt with worse threats than a small-town bully. With daddy issues. The key would be patience and preparation, choosing the right moment and the right response when the inevitable confrontation came. The rest of her visit to the school went smoothly. Principal Hendricks showed her the supply closets, explained the curriculum requirements, and gave her the class roster for her 23 fourth-grade students. Sarah spent some time in her classroom, beginning to envision how she wanted to arrange the desks and plan her lessons. Teaching had always been a secret dream of hers, something she'd thought about during long deployments overseas, and being here in her own classroom made it feel real for the first time. As she was leaving the school that afternoon, Sarah noticed a pickup truck parked across the street with 3 familiar figures leaning against it. Tyler, Marcus, and Jim were clearly waiting for her, watching the school with the predatory patience of hunters stalking prey. Sarah pretended not to notice them as she walked to her car, but she was acutely aware of their presence and the implied threat it represented. The Honda started on the 3rd try, as it always did, and Sarah pulled out of the parking lot with Tyler's truck following at a distance. She wasn't particularly worried about a confrontation in broad daylight on public streets, but she made note of their license plate number and the route they took as they tailed her toward her new apartment. Sarah had rented a small furnished apartment above Peterson's Pharmacy on Main Street, partly because it was affordable and partly because it offered good visibility of the street below. The apartment was modest but clean, with a living room, kitchenette, bedroom, and bathroom that met her simple needs. She'd shipped a few boxes of personal belongings from her previous address, but she'd learned to travel light during her military years. Tyler's truck drove past the pharmacy twice after she parked, the occupants making no effort to hide their surveillance. Sarah watched from her living room window as they finally parked down the street and appeared to settle in for a longer observation. It was amateur hour intimidation, the kind of thing that might work on someone who hadn't spent years dealing with actual threats in hostile territory. Sarah unpacked her few belongings while keeping one eye on the street below. Her personal items were sparse but meaningful. A photo of her parents taken shortly before their deaths in a car accident when she was 19. A Purple Heart medal she kept in a small wooden box. A few books that had sustained her through difficult deployments. And a knife that had been a gift from her squad leader before her final mission. As evening approached, Tyler's crew finally gave up their surveillance and drove away, apparently satisfied that they'd made their point. Sarah made herself a simple dinner and continued organizing her new home, all while thinking about the problem that Tyler Brennan represented. She'd come to Millbrook hoping for peace and a chance to build a normal life, but it seemed like conflict had followed her here despite her best efforts to avoid it. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Sarah would go about her business, whether it was shopping for groceries, exploring the town, or visiting the school to prepare her classroom, and Tyler's crew would appear shortly afterward to make their presence known. They never approached her directly or did anything overtly threatening, but the message was clear. They were watching her, and they wanted her to know it. The harassment escalated gradually, as Sarah had expected it would. Her mail started disappearing. From the box outside the pharmacy, someone left a bag of garbage on the hood of her car one morning. The antenna was bent on her Honda, and someone had used a key or similar object to scratch a long line along the passenger side door. Sarah documented each incident with photographs and written descriptions, building a case file the way she'd been trained to do. She also began varying her routines, taking different routes to and from common destinations, and paying closer attention to her surroundings. These were basic security measures that had become second nature during her military service. Helen Murphy proved to be a valuable ally during this period. She made a point of checking on Sarah every morning when she came in for breakfast, and she wasn't shy about expressing her disapproval of Tyler's behavior to anyone who would listen. Other townspeople began to take notice as well, though most were too intimidated by Tyler's reputation to openly support Sarah. "This has gone far enough," Helen declared one morning as she served Sarah's usual coffee and eggs. "That boy is out of control, and his father needs to rein him in before someone gets hurt. Has anyone tried talking to Mr. Brennan?" Sarah asked. "Sheriff Morrison went out there after the second incident with your car, but Robert Brennan just shrugged it off. Said boys will be boys, and there's no proof Tyler was involved. He's been saying the same thing for years." Sarah nodded, not surprised by this response. In her experience, bullies rarely changed their behavior until they faced real consequences. And Tyler had been insulated from consequences his entire life. But that protection would only last as long as he stuck to minor harassment and property damage. If he escalated to something more serious, even his father's money and influence might not be enough to save him. The question was whether Tyler was smart enough to recognize that line, or if his arrogance would eventually lead him to cross it. Based on what Sarah had observed so far, she suspected it was only a matter of time before he made a mistake that would give her the opening she needed to respond appropriately. A week before school was scheduled to start, Sarah spent the entire day at Millbrook Elementary putting the finishing touches on her classroom. She arranged the desks in small groups to encourage collaboration, organized her teaching materials, and created bulletin board displays that would welcome her students on their first day. The work was satisfying in a way that surprised her, tapping into creative instincts she hadn't used since childhood. Carol Jenkins stopped by several times throughout the day to offer advice and assistance, and Sarah was grateful for both the help and the friendship that was developing between them. Carol had taught 4th grade herself for several years before moving up to 5th, and she had practical insights about curriculum pacing and classroom management that would be invaluable to a first-year teacher. "You're going to do great," Carol assured her as they shared lunch in Sarah's classroom. "The kids are going to love you, and you've got good instincts about how to set up a learning environment." "Thanks. I have to admit, I'm more nervous about teaching than I expected to be. It's one thing to plan lessons on paper, and another thing entirely to stand up in front of 23 4th graders and actually teach them something. The nerves are normal. Every teacher feels that way before their first class. But you'll find your rhythm quickly. The kids can tell when someone genuinely cares about them, and it's obvious that you do." As the afternoon wore on, other teachers began arriving to work in their own classrooms, and Sarah was introduced to more of her colleagues. The math teacher, the art teacher, the librarian, and several others all made her feel welcome and offered their support. It was the kind of collegial atmosphere she'd hoped to find, and it reinforced her decision to pursue teaching as her post-military career. Sarah stayed at school until well after dark, wanting to make sure everything was perfect for the first day of classes. By the time she finished, her classroom looked like something from an education magazine, with colorful displays, organized learning centers, and a warm, inviting atmosphere that would help her students feel comfortable and excited about learning. The parking lot was empty except for her Honda when she finally gathered her things and headed for the exit. The night air was cool and pleasant, with the sound of crickets and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves on the old oak trees that surrounded the school. Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment and anticipation as she walked toward her car, thinking about the students she would meet in just a few days. It wasn't until she reached the Honda that she realized something was wrong. The car was sitting lower than it should be, and as she got closer, she could see that all 4 tires had been slashed. Long, deliberate cuts had been made in the sidewalls, ensuring that the tires were completely destroyed and couldn't be repaired. Sarah stood for a moment in the empty parking lot, staring at her vandalized car and feeling a familiar surge of anger that she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a deliberate escalation designed to intimidate her and interfere with her ability to do her job. Tyler Brennan had just crossed a line that he shouldn't have crossed. She pulled out her cell phone and called Sheriff Morrison, reporting the vandalism in a calm, professional voice that gave no hint of the fury building inside her. Then she called Carol Jenkins to ask for a ride home, explaining what had happened and listening to her friend's outraged response. "This has gone too far," Carol said when she arrived 20 minutes later. "Tyler needs to be stopped before he hurts someone." "Yes, he does," Sarah agreed, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that made Carol glance at her sharply. "And I think it's time someone taught him that actions have consequences." As they drove away from the school, leaving the Honda sitting alone in the parking lot with its ruined tires, Sarah was already planning her response. She'd tried to avoid conflict, tried to keep her head down and blend in, but Tyler Brennan had made that impossible. He wanted a fight, and now he was going to get one. But it wouldn't be the kind of fight he was expecting. Sarah Mitchell had been trained by the United States Marine Corps to handle much more dangerous enemies than a small-town bully with delusions of grandeur. Tyler thought he was dealing with a helpless teacher who could be intimidated into submission. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The morning after the tire-slashing incident, Sarah woke before dawn as she had every day for the past 8 years. Military habits died hard, and despite her best efforts to adjust to civilian life, her internal clock still operated on Marine Corps time. She made coffee in the small kitchenette of her apartment and stood at the window watching Main Street come to life below. Sheriff Morrison had been professional but not particularly optimistic when he'd arrived at the school the previous night. He'd taken photos, filled out a report, and promised to investigate, but they both knew the chances of proving Tyler's involvement were slim. The security cameras at the school only covered the main entrances, not the parking lot, and Tyler was too smart to leave obvious evidence behind. Sarah had spent most of the night thinking about her options. She could file an insurance claim for the tires, though her coverage probably wouldn't pay for much given the age of her Honda. She could ask for a transfer to another school district, though that would mean abandoning her students before she'd even met them. Or she could stay and fight, using skills and experience that Tyler Brennan couldn't possibly imagine she possessed. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. Sarah Mitchell had never backed down from a fight in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. But this wouldn't be a simple confrontation settled with fists and bravado. This would require strategy, patience, and the kind of precise planning that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. Her phone rang at 7:30, interrupting her tactical assessment of the situation. Carol Jenkins sounded tired but determined when she spoke. "I've been thinking about what happened last night," Carol said without preamble. "This can't continue. Tyler is escalating, and someone needs to stop him before he really hurts someone." "I agree," Sarah replied calmly. "What do you have in mind?" "Well, first things first, you need transportation. My husband Dave runs the auto repair shop here in town, and he's got a loaner car you can use while we figure out what to do about your Honda. It's not much to look at, but it runs." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for Carol's kindness. In her military experience, the best way to evaluate someone's character was to see how they responded when things got difficult, and Carol was proving herself to be exactly the kind of person Sarah had hoped to find in a small town like Millbrook. "That's incredibly generous," Sarah said. "Are you sure your husband won't mind? Dave's been wanting an excuse to get that old truck out of the shop anyway. Besides, he's just as fed up with Tyler's nonsense as the rest of us. The Brennans may have money, but that doesn't give them the right to terrorize decent people." An hour later, Sarah met Dave Jenkins at his auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. He was a burly man in his 50s with calloused hands and an honest face, the kind of person who'd built his reputation, one satisfied customer at a time. The loaner vehicle turned out to be a 15-year-old Ford pickup truck with more rust than paint, but it started on the first try and felt solid on the road. "She's not pretty, but she's reliable," Dave explained as he handed Sarah the keys. "And if Tyler or his boys try any more of their nonsense, at least you'll be driving something with some weight behind it." "What's the story with Tyler's family?" Sarah asked. "Everyone seems afraid of them, but I'm new here and don't understand the dynamics." Dave's expression darkened. "Robert Brennan owns about half the farmland in this county, plus the grain elevator and the equipment dealership. Lot of folks around here depend on him for their livelihood, which makes it hard for anyone to stand up to his boy. Sheriff Morrison's done what he can, but without solid evidence or willing witnesses, his hands are tied. And Tyler knows he's protected." "Exactly. Been that way since he was in middle school. Kid's never faced real consequences for anything he's done, so he just keeps pushing to see how far he can go." Sarah nodded, filing away this information for future use. In her experience, bullies like Tyler eventually made mistakes when they felt invincible, and those mistakes created opportunities for the people they'd been terrorizing. She spent the rest of the morning running errands around town, partly to take care of practical matters and partly to gauge how the community was responding to the previous night's vandalism. The reaction was mixed but telling. Some people, like Helen Murphy, were openly supportive and angry about what had happened. Others seemed nervous, as if associating with Sarah might make them targets as well. At the hardware store, she overheard two men discussing the incident in hushed tones near the paint display. One of them, a thin man in overalls, shook his head sadly as he spoke. "It's a damn shame," he said. "That girl seems nice enough, and she's just trying to do her job. But Tyler's not going to let up until she leaves town or submits to his authority." "Somebody needs to put that boy in his place," the other man replied. "But who's going to do it? His daddy's got too much pull around here." Sarah pretended to examine a display of screwdrivers while listening to their conversation. It was clear that Tyler's behavior was widely resented, but fear of economic retaliation kept most people from speaking out. This was exactly the kind of environment that allowed bullies to thrive, and Sarah recognized it from other situations she'd encountered during her military service. At the grocery store, she had a more encouraging encounter with Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher she'd replaced. The elderly woman approached her in the produce section with a look of concern and determination. "I heard about what happened to your car," Mrs. Patterson said without preamble. "I want you to know that not everyone in this town is afraid of the Brennans." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "That means a lot. I should have stood up to them years ago when they started targeting me. But I was close to retirement and didn't want to rock the boat. I regret that now, especially knowing that my silence might have encouraged them to go after you." Sarah studied the older woman's face, seeing genuine remorse and anger there. "It's not your responsibility to fight everyone's battles, Mrs. Patterson. Tyler made his own choices." "Maybe so, but good people have a responsibility to stand up to bullies when they can. I failed that test, and I don't want to see you suffer because of it." Mrs. Patterson leaned closer, lowering her voice. "There are more people in this town who support you than you might think. They're just afraid to say so openly. But if push comes to shove, if Tyler really crosses the line, you won't be standing alone." This conversation stayed with Sarah as she continued her errands. It was encouraging to know that she had potential allies in the community, even if they couldn't openly support her yet. But it also confirmed her assessment that any solution to the Tyler problem would have to come from her directly. The townspeople might cheer from the sidelines, but they couldn't be counted on to take action when it mattered. That afternoon, Sarah drove out to the school to assess the damage to her Honda and make arrangements for new tires. The car looked even worse in daylight, sitting forlorn and obviously disabled in the middle of the empty parking lot. The slashes in the tires were clean and deliberate, the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Principal Hendricks was waiting for her when she arrived, his face grim with anger and embarrassment. He'd clearly taken the vandalism as a personal affront to his school and his ability to protect his staff. "I've called a towing company to take your car to Dave's shop," he said immediately. "And I want you to know that this kind of behavior is absolutely unacceptable. I've already spoken with Superintendent Walsh about increasing security around the school." "I appreciate that," Sarah replied. "But I don't think security cameras are going to solve this problem. Tyler's too smart to get caught on video, and he's already proven he's willing to escalate. What do you suggest we do? I can't have my teachers afraid to come to work." Sarah looked at the principal carefully, trying to gauge how much she could trust him with her real thoughts. He seemed genuinely concerned about her welfare, but he was also a school administrator with his own career and reputation to protect. "Tyler's testing boundaries," she said finally. "He wants to see how far he can push before someone pushes back. The vandalism was a message that he can reach me anywhere, even at school. The question is how we respond to that message. You sound like you have experience with this kind of situation." "I do, and in my experience, bullies like Tyler only understand one thing: strength. They'll keep escalating until they encounter someone who can't be intimidated." "Principal." Hendricks frowned. "I hope you're not suggesting anything inappropriate. We have to handle this through proper channels." "Of course," Sarah agreed, though privately she thought the proper channels had already proven inadequate. "I'm just saying that Tyler needs to understand that there are consequences for his actions." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the tow truck, which loaded Sarah's Honda onto its flatbed with efficient competence. As the truck drove away, Sarah felt a strange sense of liberation. The car had been one of her last connections to her previous life, and its destruction seemed to mark the end of her attempt to blend quietly into civilian society. That evening, Sarah drove the borrowed pickup to Murphy's Diner for dinner, knowing that Tyler and his crew often hung out there in the evenings. She wasn't looking for a confrontation, but she wanted to send her own message, that she wasn't hiding, wasn't intimidated, and wasn't going anywhere. The diner was busy with the usual dinner crowd, families and working people grabbing a meal before heading home for the night. Sarah chose the same booth she'd occupied on her first morning in town, ordering coffee and the meatloaf special while keeping an eye on the door. Tyler arrived 20 minutes later with Marcus and Jim in tow, swaggering through the entrance like he owned the place. He spotted Sarah immediately and made a beeline for her table, his cronies flanking him in their usual formation. "Well, if it isn't our new teacher," Tyler said loudly enough for the entire diner to hear. "How'd you like your welcome gift last night?" The restaurant went quiet, conversation stopping as people turned to watch the confrontation. Sarah took a sip of her coffee and looked up at Tyler with the same calm expression she'd maintained during their first encounter. "I assume you're referring to the vandalism of my car," she said evenly. "It was juvenile and pathetic, exactly what I'd expect from someone with nothing better to do than destroy other people's property." Tyler's grin faltered slightly at her matter-of-fact response. He'd clearly expected fear or anger, not calm dismissal. "Careful, teacher lady," he said, leaning down to put his face closer to hers. "You're new here, so maybe you don't understand how things work. But accidents happen to people who don't know their place." Sarah set down her coffee cup and stood up slowly, her movement fluid and controlled. Even standing, she was several inches shorter than Tyler, but something in her posture made him take an involuntary step backward. "Let me make something clear to you, Tyler," she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent diner. "I know exactly what you did to my car, and I know you think your daddy's money will protect you from the consequences. But here's what you don't know. I'm not Mrs. Patterson. I'm not some helpless old woman you can frighten into submission." Tyler recovered his swagger quickly, though his eyes showed a flicker of uncertainty. Is that supposed to scare me? You're a schoolteacher, sweetheart. What are you going to do? Give me detention? Sarah smiled then, and several people in the diner shifted uncomfortably at the expression. It wasn't a friendly smile, or even an angry one. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how a fight would end before it even started. I'm going to give you some free advice, she said. Walk away. Stop harassing me. Stop vandalizing my property. And find something productive to do with your life. Because if you continue down this path, you're going to discover that some people fight back in ways you never expected. The silence in the diner stretched for several long seconds as Tyler processed her words. He was clearly torn between his need to maintain face in front of his crew and a growing suspicion that he might be dealing with something more dangerous than he'd anticipated. You threatening me? He asked finally. I'm educating you, Sarah replied. Consider it a public service. Tyler's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he'd assumed would be an easy target. But backing down now would be a sign of weakness that his reputation couldn't afford. We'll see about that, he snarled. This isn't over, teacher lady. Not by a long shot. No, Sarah agreed quietly. I don't suppose it is. Tyler stormed out of the diner with his crew trailing behind, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. The normal conversation level gradually resumed as people processed what they'd witnessed, though Sarah could feel eyes on her. As she finished her meal, Helen Murphy appeared at her table a few minutes later, refilling her coffee cup with shaking hands. That was either very brave or very foolish, Helen said quietly. I'm not sure which. Probably both, Sarah admitted. But Tyler needed to understand that intimidation isn't going to work on me. He's not going to let this go. You know that, right? He'll come after you harder now. Sarah nodded grimly. I'm counting on it. Tyler's been getting away with this behavior for years because nobody's ever made him pay a real price for it. That's about to change. Helen looked at her with new interest, seeing something in Sarah's demeanor that hadn't been apparent before. You're not really just a teacher, are you? I'm exactly what I said I am, Sarah replied. But that doesn't mean it's all I've ever been. Over the next few days, the harassment continued but took on a different character. Tyler and his crew began following Sarah more aggressively, making sure she saw them wherever she went. They parked outside her apartment at all hours, revving their engines and playing loud music. Someone threw a rock through the window of Peterson's pharmacy one night, though it couldn't be proven who was responsible. Sarah documented each incident, with photographs and detailed notes, building a comprehensive record of Tyler's escalating behavior. She also began making discreet inquiries around town, learning more about his patterns and routines. If Tyler wanted to play psychological warfare, she would show him what a real professional looked like. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jim Hartley, the nervous member of Tyler's crew, approached Sarah outside the grocery store 3 days before school was scheduled to start. He looked around nervously before speaking, clearly terrified of being seen talking to her. I need to tell you something, he said in a rush. Tyler's planning something big for tomorrow night. He's been talking about teaching you a lesson you'll never forget. Sarah studied the young man's face, seeing genuine fear and guilt there. Why are you telling me this? Because what happened to your car was my fault too, and I feel sick about it. I never wanted to be part of this stuff, but Tyler, he's got ways of making people do what he wants. What kind of ways? Jim swallowed hard. My dad works at the Brennan farm. Has for 15 years. Tyler knows that if I don't go along with what he wants, he can get my dad fired. And there aren't many other jobs around here that pay enough to support a family. Sarah nodded, understanding the economic coercion that Tyler used to maintain his crew. It was a more sophisticated form of bullying than simple physical intimidation, and it explained why so many people in town were afraid to oppose him. "What's he planning for tomorrow night?" she asked. "He won't say exactly, but he's been talking about making sure you understand your place. And he told Marcus to bring some of his friends from the next county over. Guys who don't mind getting their hands dirty." This was the escalation Sarah had been expecting. Tyler's ego had been bruised by their confrontation in the diner, and he was preparing to respond with overwhelming force. Bringing in outsiders suggested he was planning something more serious than simple harassment. "Jim," Sarah said carefully, "I want you to stay away from Tyler tomorrow night. Whatever he's planning, don't be a part of it. I can't. If I don't show up, he'll know I warned you. Then show up, but find an excuse to leave early. Have a family emergency or get sick. Do whatever you have to do, but don't be there when things go bad." Jim nodded gratefully and hurried away, glancing over his shoulder to make sure nobody had seen him talking to her. Sarah watched him go, feeling a mixture of sympathy and strategic satisfaction. Tyler's own crew was beginning to crack under the pressure of his escalating behavior, which meant his support base was weaker than it appeared. That evening, Sarah made her own preparations for whatever Tyler had planned. She called Sheriff Morrison and reported Jim's warning, though she doubted he would be able to do much with second-hand information. She also called Carol Jenkins and asked her to keep an eye on the school and her apartment, just in case Tyler decided to target those locations. Most importantly, she opened the wooden box that contained her Purple Heart and removed the combat knife that lay beneath it. The blade was 7 inches of blackened steel with a grip wrapped in paracord, designed for efficiency rather than appearance. She'd carried it through 3 deployments and hoped never to need it again. But Tyler Brennan was forcing her hand in ways he couldn't possibly understand. Sarah spent an hour that night performing maintenance on the knife, checking the edge and the grip wrap, running through muscle memory exercises that came back as naturally as breathing. She also reviewed her emergency contact information and wrote a brief note explaining the situation, to be found in case something happened to her. These preparations might seem excessive for dealing with a small-town bully, but Sarah's military training had taught her to plan for the worst-case scenario while hoping for the best. Tyler had already proven he was willing to commit crimes to maintain his dominance, and bringing in outside help suggested he was prepared to escalate to serious violence. The next morning brought the news that Sarah had been both expecting and dreading. Her Honda, which had been sitting at Dave's repair shop waiting for new tires, had been found burned to a shell in the woods outside town. Sheriff Morrison called her personally to deliver the news, his voice tight with anger and frustration. "This is getting out of hand," he said bluntly. "Tyler's not even trying to hide his involvement anymore. But without witnesses or physical evidence linking him to the scene, I still can't make an arrest." "I understand," Sarah replied, though privately she was furious. The Honda hadn't been much to look at, but it had been hers, and its destruction felt like a personal violation. More importantly, it represented another escalation in Tyler's campaign of harassment. "Sarah, I'm going to be honest with you," Sheriff Morrison continued. "I think you should consider leaving town, at least temporarily. Tyler's clearly fixated on you, and I'm afraid someone's going to get seriously hurt before this is over. I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I'm not running away from a bully. Besides, if I leave now, who's going to teach my students? They don't deserve to suffer because Tyler Brennan has a problem with authority." There was a long pause before Sheriff Morrison responded. "I figured you'd say that. Just be careful, okay? And if anything happens, call me immediately." Sarah spent the day making final preparations for the start of school, which was now just 2 days away. Her classroom was ready, her lesson plans were complete, and she'd memorized the names and faces of all 23 students who would be in her care. Despite everything that had happened with Tyler, she was still excited about beginning her teaching career. That afternoon, she received an unexpected visit from Robert Brennan himself. Tyler's father arrived at her apartment without warning, his expensive truck parked conspicuously in front of Peterson's pharmacy. He was a tall, heavy-set man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that came from wielding power in a small community for decades. "Miss Mitchell," he said when Sarah answered her door. "I'm Robert Brennan. I think we need to talk." Sarah studied his face, seeing the same arrogance that his son displayed, but tempered with more intelligence and self-control. This was a man who'd built his empire through careful calculation rather than brute force, though the end result was the same kind of dominance. "What can I do for you, Mr. Brennan? May I come in? This is a conversation we should have in private." Against her better judgment, Sarah stepped aside and let him enter her small apartment. Robert Brennan looked around with the appraising gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating property and people for their worth. "Nice place," he said, though his tone suggested he found it modest and unremarkable. "Quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where a person could be very happy if they didn't go looking for trouble." "I didn't go looking for trouble, Mr. Brennan. Your son brought it to me." Robert's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Boys will be boys, Miss Mitchell. Sometimes they get a little rowdy, especially when they feel their territory is being invaded by outsiders. Is that what you call vandalizing my car and burning it to scrap metal? Boys being boys? I don't know anything about any burned cars," Robert said smoothly. "But I do know that misunderstandings can escalate quickly in a small town. Sometimes the best thing for everyone involved is for the source of confusion to move on." Sarah felt her temper rising but kept her voice level. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Brennan? I'm offering you an opportunity. I understand you have some student loans from college, and I imagine your insurance settlement for the car won't cover much, given its age and condition. These things can be expensive problems for someone on a teacher's salary." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, setting it on her small dining table. "There's $10,000 in there. Enough to pay off your debts and give you a fresh start somewhere else. All you have to do is resign from the teaching position and leave Millbrook tonight." Sarah stared at the envelope, understanding the full scope of what Robert Brennan was offering. It wasn't just money. It was a way out of the conflict with his son, a chance to avoid whatever Tyler had planned for that evening. It was also confirmation that the Brennan family viewed her as enough of a threat to warrant direct intervention. "What happens if I don't take your offer?" she asked. Robert's smile was cold and calculating. "Then you'll have to deal with the consequences of your decision. Millbrook can be a difficult place for people who don't fit in, Miss Mitchell. Accidents happen. Opportunities disappear. Life becomes unpleasant. And if I do take it, what guarantee do I have that Tyler won't just find another target? My son is a good boy who sometimes makes poor choices. With the right guidance and the removal of external provocations, I'm confident he'll settle down and focus on more productive activities." Sarah looked at Robert Brennan and saw everything she'd learned to despise during her military service: corruption, cowardice, and the abuse of power to protect the guilty at the expense of the innocent. He was offering her money to abandon her students and her principles, to let Tyler continue terrorizing anyone who crossed his path. "Mr. Brennan," she said quietly, "you can take your money and get out of my apartment." Robert's facade of politeness finally cracked, revealing the ruthless man underneath. "You're making a mistake, Miss Mitchell. A serious mistake. My family has been part of this community for 4 generations. We have deep roots here, and people depend on us for their livelihoods. You're just a teacher with no connections and no protection. You cannot win this fight." "We'll see about that," Sarah replied, opening the door and waiting for him to leave. Robert picked up his envelope and headed for the exit, pausing in the doorway to deliver one final warning. My son has some friends coming to visit tonight. Out-of-town friends who don't know you and don't care about your welfare. If I were you, I'd reconsider my position before it's too late." After he left, Sarah sat in her living room thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about the situation she was facing. Robert Brennan's visit confirmed that Tyler's planned escalation had his father's knowledge, if not his explicit approval. The offer of money suggested they viewed her as a serious enough threat to warrant expensive measures to remove her. Most telling of all was Robert's warning about out-of-town friends. This wasn't going to be another confrontation with local boys who were mostly bluster and intimidation. Tyler was bringing in real muscle, people who might be willing to use serious violence to achieve their goals. Sarah had faced worse odds during her military service, but those had been legitimate combat operations with rules of engagement and backup support. This was different, a lone teacher facing multiple attackers in a civilian setting where the use of force carried legal and ethical complications that didn't exist on a battlefield. As evening approached, Sarah made her final preparations for whatever Tyler had planned. She dressed in dark, practical clothing that would allow freedom of movement. She secured her apartment, making sure all windows and doors were locked and creating clear sight lines to potential entry points. Most importantly, she positioned her combat knife where she could reach it quickly if needed. At 9 o'clock, Tyler's truck pulled up outside Peterson's pharmacy, accompanied by 2 other vehicles Sarah didn't recognize. She watched from her window as 6 men got out and gathered on the sidewalk below, their body language aggressive and purposeful. Tyler was gesturing toward her apartment window, clearly pointing out her location to his reinforcements. Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always descended on her before combat operations, a state of heightened awareness combined with emotional detachment that allowed her to think clearly under pressure. These men thought they were dealing with a helpless teacher who could be intimidated or assaulted with impunity. They had no idea they were about to encounter a United States Marine who'd survived 3 combat tours and had no intention of being anyone's victim. The confrontation that would define Sarah Mitchell's future in Millbrook was about to begin, and Tyler Brennan was about to learn that some people fight back in ways he'd never imagined possible. Tyler's voice carried up from the street as he addressed his reinforcements, his words slurred with alcohol and bravado. Sarah counted 6 men total, including Tyler, Marcus, and 4 strangers who looked like they'd stepped out of a prison yard. They were older than Tyler's usual crew, harder looking, with the kind of casual violence that came from years of hurting people for money. The group moved toward the side entrance of Peterson's pharmacy, where a narrow staircase led to Sarah's apartment. She could hear their heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs, punctuated by crude laughter and Tyler's increasingly confident threats about what they were going to do to the uppity teacher who didn't know her place. Sarah positioned herself behind her kitchen counter, which provided both cover and a clear view of the apartment's only entrance. The knife was within easy reach, though she hoped the situation wouldn't escalate to the point where she'd need it. Her military training had taught her to always hope for the best while preparing for the worst. The first knock on her door was deceptively polite, almost gentle. Tyler's voice came through the thin wood, artificially friendly and mocking. "Miss Mitchell? We'd like to have a word with you. Just want to clear up some misunderstandings about how things work around here." Sarah remained silent, knowing that any response would only encourage them. The knocking became more insistent, then turned into pounding that shook the entire doorframe. Someone kicked the door hard enough to crack the wood around the deadbolt. "Come on out, teacher lady," Tyler called, his pretense of politeness abandoned. "We're not going anywhere until we have our little chat." The lock gave way on the 3rd kick, and the door slammed open to reveal Tyler and his crew crowding into her small living room. They looked around with predatory interest, taking in the modest furnishings and Sarah's calm posture behind the kitchen counter. "There she is," Tyler said with satisfaction. Our brave little teacher who thinks she's too good for Millbrook hospitality. The four strangers spread out through the apartment with practiced efficiency, cutting off potential escape routes and establishing control of the space. These weren't amateurs or local troublemakers. They were professionals who'd done this kind of work before. "Tyler," Sarah said quietly, "you're making the biggest mistake of your life. Walk away now, and I'll pretend this never happened." Tyler laughed, emboldened by his numerical advantage and the presence of his hired muscle. "I don't think you understand the situation here, sweetheart. You're outnumbered 6-1, alone in your apartment, with no way to call for help. Nobody's coming to save you." "I don't need saving," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a steel edge that made one of the strangers glance at her sharply. "I need you to leave, now." The largest of Tyler's reinforcements, a bearded man with scarred knuckles and prison tattoos, stepped forward with a cruel grin. "She's got spirit, I'll give her that. This is going to be fun." What happened next would be talked about in Millbrook for decades to come, though few people would believe the full story. Sarah moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone her size, flowing around the kitchen counter like liquid death. The bearded man reached for her first and found himself airborne, his own momentum used against him as Sarah executed a perfect hip throw that sent him crashing into her dining table. The furniture exploded under his weight, leaving him stunned and gasping on the floor. The second attacker pulled a knife, which proved to be a fatal mistake. Sarah's combat training had taught her that once weapons appeared, the rules changed completely. She struck the man's wrist with surgical precision, breaking bones and sending the knife flying across the room. Her follow-up elbow to his temple dropped him unconscious before he hit the ground. Tyler and the remaining two men rushed her simultaneously, thinking their numbers would overwhelm her. Sarah ducked under a wild haymaker, swept the legs out from under the third attacker, and caught Tyler with a palm strike to the solar plexus that folded him in half. The last man tried to grab her from behind and found himself flipped over her shoulder, landing hard on his back with his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. The entire confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. When the violence ended, 5 men lay scattered around Sarah's apartment in various states of consciousness and injury. Only Tyler remained on his feet, doubled over and gasping for air, his face pale with shock and pain. Sarah stood in the center of the destruction, not even breathing hard, her posture relaxed but ready for continued action. The knife she'd hoped not to need remained untouched on the counter. "That was a warm-up," she said conversationally. "I was being gentle because I don't want to explain multiple deaths to Sheriff Morrison. But if any of you ever threaten me again, if you so much as look at me wrong, I will end you permanently." Tyler stared at her with dawning horror, finally understanding that he'd brought weapons to a fight with someone who was herself a weapon. The quiet teacher he'd thought would be an easy victim had just dismantled 6 grown men without breaking a sweat. "What are you?" he whispered. "I'm exactly what I told you I was," Sarah replied. "A teacher who wants to be left alone. But I'm also a United States Marine who spent 3 tours in Afghanistan, keeping people like you from hurting innocent civilians. I know 17 different ways to kill a person with my bare hands, and that's just what I remember from Tuesday's training." She stepped closer to Tyler, who instinctively backed toward the broken door. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to gather up your friends and leave. You're never going to bother me again. You're going to stop terrorizing the people of this town. And if I ever hear about you hurting anyone else, I'll come looking for you." Tyler nodded frantically, helping his groaning companions to their feet and half carrying them toward the exit. The man with the broken arm was crying, the bearded giant was still seeing stars, and the one who'd been knocked unconscious was mumbling incoherently. "Tyler," Sarah called as he reached the doorway. He turned back reluctantly, terror written across his face. "Tell your father that his money can't buy him out of every problem. some fights have to be finished. After they left, Sarah surveyed the damage to her apartment with professional detachment. The furniture could be replaced, the door could be repaired, and the bloodstains would come out with enough bleach. More importantly, the Tyler Brennan problem had been permanently solved. She called Sheriff Morrison to report the break-in and assault, giving him a carefully edited version of events that emphasized Tyler's aggression while downplaying her own capabilities. By the time Morrison arrived with his deputies, Sarah had cleaned herself up and arranged the scene to support her story of self-defense against multiple attackers. The sheriff took one look at the destruction and the condition of Tyler's crew, then looked at Sarah with new respect and a healthy dose of wariness. 6 against 1, he said thoughtfully. And you came out without a scratch. I got lucky, Sarah replied. They were drunk and overconfident. Morrison nodded, though his expression suggested he didn't entirely believe her modest explanation. Well, whatever happened here tonight, I'd say Tyler Brennan learned an important lesson about picking his targets. The news of Tyler's humiliating defeat spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By morning, everyone in town knew that the quiet new teacher had single-handedly defeated 6 attackers, though the details grew more dramatic with each retelling. Some versions had Sarah throwing grown men through windows, others claimed she'd used martial arts weapons, and a few insisted she'd killed at least 2 people and hidden the bodies. Tyler himself was nowhere to be found. He'd left town that same night, according to his father, heading to relatives in another state where he could think about his choices. The 4 hired muscle had been arrested for breaking and entering, and their injuries required medical attention that would keep them occupied for weeks. Robert Brennan made no attempt to retaliate or seek revenge. Whatever Tyler had told him about the confrontation had apparently convinced the older man that Sarah Mitchell was not someone to be trifled with. The harassment stopped completely, and the Brennan name was no longer whispered with fear in Millbrook streets. The first day of school arrived with Sarah standing confidently in front of her 4th grade classroom, greeting 23 excited students who had no idea their teacher was already a local legend. The children were eager to learn, well-behaved, and genuinely sweet, reminding Sarah why she'd chosen teaching as her post-military career. During lunch break, Carol Jenkins found her in the teacher's lounge, still marveling at how completely the Tyler situation had been resolved. I don't know what you did to those boys, Carol said with admiration, but whatever it was, it worked. The whole town feels different now. People are walking taller, speaking up more. It's like you broke some kind of spell that's been hanging over us for years. Sarah smiled as she graded papers, thinking about her students and the lessons she would teach them about standing up to bullies and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes, she said quietly, all it takes is one person willing to fight back. Bullies count on good people doing nothing. When someone finally says no, really says it and means it, the whole dynamic changes. Within a month, Sarah had become one of the most respected teachers in Millbrook's history. Her classroom management was legendary, her lessons were engaging, and every student in her care knew they were safe and valued. The self-defense classes she offered after school became so popular they had to move to the gymnasium. Tyler Brennan never returned to Millbrook. The last anyone heard, he was working construction in another state, keeping his head down and his mouth shut. His father sold the family farm within a year and moved away as well, unable to face the daily reminder of his son's defeat. Sheriff Morrison never asked Sarah directly about her military background, but he made sure everyone in town knew that their new teacher was someone special. Someone who'd served her country with honor and brought those same values to their community. Years later, Sarah's former students would remember her not just as the teacher who'd stood up to the town's worst bully, but as the woman who'd taught them that strength meant protecting others, that courage meant doing what's right, even when it's hard, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous. The quiet teacher with the modest Honda had become a guardian, a protector, and a symbol of what happened when good people finally said enough. Tyler Brennan had thought he was attacking a helpless victim, but instead he'd awakened something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. He'd awakened a Marine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.